Well, this person says, I always have a problem to find the true background color or color relationship between objects in still life, especially still life that has objects of various color. Would you please help me with that? Yeah, I've seen a lot of people have that problem. Let's solve it. You know, I think one of the things that causes problems with painters, especially emerging painters, are the labels we put on things. If you label something, that label can be restrictive. Now think about the label background. Background, just the word itself, makes things feel maybe secondary or not quite as important. Background, that's a background for this, background for that. What if we substitute that word for environment? In the still life painting, or in a still life we are looking at, whether we set the still life up in one of those little boxes, still life boxes, or whether we find a still life that in our environment, that space around it is environment. It's behind it, it's in front of it, but it's surrounding it too. And so we can learn to think of that as environment. It might help with how we handle that. Another thing I want to point out is one of the best ways to learn how to handle things is to go to the masters. I'm not talking about just everybody that posts paintings on the internet, because we always know they're not always, you know, maybe the best you can find. But stick with your masters. Study the masters. Learn how to study masters by asking the question, what were they doing? How did they do that? What are they doing? Now, I'm going to recommend 4 master painters, easily found online, relatively contemporary, that are excellent with still life painting. They're all trained. They all know what they're doing. So, and you can look at this list and you can make a note of the list and look them up online and ask the same questions. I'm going to show you how to go about doing that. Richard Schmid, of course, you know I put him on the top because I think he was a master of all areas of realistic painting. But Richard Schmid, Chung Wang, who has a really good solid classical training and handles those environment areas around objects in still life beautifully. His still lifes always have a life to them, and you always feel that the color is relative. The color of the area around the image is relative to the images. And that was the question that person asked. Kathy Anderson is another one. And then Kwang Ho. All those you can find online. Unfortunately, Richard is no longer with us, but there's still a lot of his images online, and the other folks are still kicking as far as I know. So there's one thing. Learn from the masters. These are the ones I recommend right now. Of course, you can always go back in history for people like Vermeer and the still life masters of the Dutch era, Dutch paintings. We won't go into that, but you don't need to do that if you get your basic ideas of what to do, how to do that from these. Now, I'm going to carry you through. I have selected a couple of Richard Schmid's still life. I said collected. I've found some of Richard Schmid's online, and I want to work with you on how he worked out, or how he used the background, what you call background. I'll go ahead and call it that since that's what you call it. The space around the images themselves. Now, sometimes, and you'll notice this, that a still life will include the area that it's placed in. In other words, the room itself. There'll be things behind the still life that show doors, windows, maybe furniture or something. And that really is a wonderful way of putting an environment in a still life. But when you don't want to do that, I have some points that you can follow, And I've got these points listed here, and I'm going to show you techniques of working with color that enable you to do that. Now, one thing that you'll notice that is pretty universal among still life artists who know what they're doing. One way that you'll find they'll do this is to use neutral colors that are either neutral cools or neutral warms. And a lot of times, sometimes the neutral color, most of the time, the neutral color is going to have in it some color that you see in here. Those neutrals, in many cases you'll see in especially Richard's still life, but others too, they'll be lighter, especially when if there's a light in a frontal light that's catching the images from one side or from the left or the right of the viewer, or maybe head on the viewer, maybe a little bit to the side of the viewer. The artist will make that environment a lighter value, such as we have here. Now you can see this is a lighter value here, it's cooler, and within it, it has variations, and the variations sometimes are in value, sometimes in hue, and sometimes in intensity, very, very seldom. You can see this one. Now these are prints, and I printed them on my printer. Color's not exact registration, but the principle is there. So here's how you can work that out. Now when you work out the color that you are using in of the images, the color of the images you're working with, then you take bits and pieces of that color, especially colors that are complements of each other. So let's just say, I'll just use this one down here, and then I'll show you how this one you could see. So you can see that the area around the negative space, we call it, the negative space around the images is much lighter. When you squint, you see it, especially much lighter than most of the values within the image itself. So we will pull out white, and I'll just put up a little area of white here on my palette. Now, what colors, what hues do we see in those images? And here's how you work that out. Look at your image. What hues do you see? Well, we see reds here, we see greens here, and we see variations on that. We see some that are leaning a little bit more towards violet there, but mainly the reds and the greens. And we do see some violets, a little bit of those violet areas in here, mostly reds and greens. You could use any combination of complementary colors and do this. Let me show you. So let's say if you're going to take, if we were to say, let's take the red and the green that we see here. Okay, so I will, and I can use almost any red, but whatever red, whether it's a warm red that leans towards orange, or if it's a cooler red that's leaning more towards violet, whichever red, it's going to work. So let's say, okay, if we put red, now this is a really high intensity red, high saturation of red. So if we put that red there, and then we said we want green. All right, so you might even, let's see, I'll pull some blue here, and I will mix into that some yellow, and we will have ourselves a green. All right, now I'm just going to take a little bit more of the yellow there. You can just use green out of the tube. You can mix it. So it doesn't matter how you come up with the hue so much as that you get the right hue or get the right color. So there's kind of a really a low saturation, a relatively low saturation of green, which we see here too. Now, so say these are the hue ranges I would be working in if I worked into, or maybe that he was. Hue range, maybe not necessarily the same pigment, doesn't matter. But we're going to create that very light negative space. And you can see it is a little redder. It has a little bit more red in it. It could have a little bit more green in it. But that's the choice you make. If you want to emphasize the red itself, well then if you create a little bit more red, add a little bit more red into the background color, the surrounding space color, then the eyes will blend with that red, and you will feel some emphasis here. If you wanted to, if the greens were how you wanted to create the overall effect of the light or the color, then you would do the same thing for green. So I'm going to show you how that works. Now, so we're going to create a neutral first. And by doing that, I'll just go into the green. I'll pull the red into the green. Now this red is a cadmium red light, so it's very, very high tinting strength. So I'll just put this into the green. And my objective here is neutralizing it, but keeping it redder. So the amount of red I add to that green will make that determination. Let's put just a little bit more of that red in it. Like this. Now the value, you see, is still very dark. All right, now I can start there. And now I'm going to start experimenting. So I've got some of that on the back of my palette knife, and I'll just pull that right into the white here, like that. And I want to see, am I in the same ballpark? I pretty much am. Try that again. A little bit more. Let's pull some of this in here, like that. And I'm pretty much in the same ballpark as that, as far as value goes, and as far as that red goes. I see though that red, now that I've done that, I see though that red is leaning a little bit more towards a red violet. Do you see that? So what I will do there is, so that's how you analyze. Ask yourself what hues you're seeing. When you start to mix, then you compare your mixture with what you're looking at and then adjust it. So if the mixture is a little bit more like this mixture is here, if I compare it like that, if it's leaning more towards the sort of oranges, and I want it to lean a little bit more towards the violets, then I would add a little bit more of the violet in there. So I'm going to reach over some red violet there, and well, let's put it right here. Put it right here in this mixture. There we go, right there. Now let's see if we don't have it. Put that red violet right in there, and you can see I'm very, very close. Now, when you start to apply that, you can notice he's got the variations in values. So the degree of value you create there around those images is going to cause it to have that value contrast that gives it that life. You have the light behind the image itself. And so when you apply it, pay attention to what the light source is doing, and create the darker values on what would be the darker side of the light source, but still keeping them relative light throughout. So you might use brush strokes, or sort of like he used brush strokes here, unless you're doing a classical interpretation where you want everything very, very smooth. Well, then you first of all to find the right value of whatever that is. And so let's see, is that his value right there? All right, let's see. So it would go something like this, where that value goes on, and then you would begin to vary. You might vary the value just a bit. You might have the value to lean a little bit more towards the red in some areas. You might have it lean a little bit more towards the neutral in other areas. You can see, and you just pull that right around the images themselves. Then as far as whether you do the images first and then the back and then the area around it, the negative space or background we call it, what a lot of artists do is build them together. They'll work the images, some of the images, for example, let's just get just a little bit, let's see if I've got the right value there. Let's see if I'll say, for example, the value, the image of the leaf there. So that's a little bit dark. Let me lighten that. All right, so I might just build those together. You see, I might build the image of the leaf. Let's build it like that. And now, of course, I'm using Schmidt's painting, as 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 an example there. But let's put a little bit of light into that. And then a lot of still life painters will then build the background as they go. Not put the whole thing in first and then paint around it, but put the images in. Schmid was a master at putting at least getting the whole image started, and then working the negative space within it. And so here's what I'm talking about here, where you might do this, and then where you might just do that sort of thing, where you just work the negative area right into it, like that. So you might even reshape it a little bit like that, or whether you might overlap the image itself like this, like that, onto the area of the negative space. So that's just a little technical thing there. Do it the way it feels right to you to do it. But that's the principle of building a light negative area, light environment within the still life image itself, and keeping that value contrast. And you see, this is kind of a warm color. You see here, you can see it's cooler, and you can see what he did here. Same thing, but he used the blues he used in the dishes here. So that's one idea for one technique, we say. So there are three really optional techniques. There are more than that, but three that are more classic. That are classic. You might say classic, or you can say tried and proven techniques for selecting the color that you're going to use in the negative area of a still life. So that's the one, using the neutral cools and neutral warms, and I didn't put here but the lighter values. Now, another one, very similar to this one, is using variations of one or more of the existing colors. The second technique, what a lot of artists use, and Schmid uses it often, and I got to say here that no artist uses the same technique all the time. You use the one that works the best. You see what's done here, where you pick up the color. You use the colors that are in the image itself according to what you want to emphasize. So if you feel the whole thing as being warm, such as you see here, then you pick up those yellow oranges and red oranges, but desaturate them. Now the desaturate, I showed you how to desaturate. You always desaturate, not with gray when you're doing still life. Desaturate with your complementary color at the same value level, changing it to the value of the color you're working with, just like you saw me do here. So if you desaturate the colors, they remain supportive. The colors within that negative space that so many people call background, needs to be supportive of all the other colors, not compete with it. And to make it supportive, you just desaturate. You add a little bit of this complement in it, and you work it in according to the values that you want to be there, according to the values that you see. So using variations of one or more of the existing colors you're working with that you're seeing here, and you choose which and how that works, that's a tried and true method for selecting color. And then the third one, is using neutralized mixtures of colors from within the still life, keeping the value ranges close. Now what I mean by that, and you see it right here, see there's a lot of overlap among all three of these, but you see a large value range within that negative space. But you can see when I say keep the values close, you don't want the values to have so much contrast among them in the negative area that they compete with the positive area. So you keep them close. You keep them close by blending them one into the other. You see how he's done that here? So you see he's got the oranges here that he's desaturated, added complement to it. And then you can see, as you squint, you see the values of the area are really very similar to the values of the still life themselves. So the value of the negative area doesn't have to be contrasted, but something has to be contrasted. In this case, it's the saturation that's contrasted. So the same colors are used here, using neutralized mixtures of the colors within the still life. The same colors are used here, but they are desaturated. And you can see as you move around, just looking just to the negative area, you can see that. Now here he's picked up on the green parts here. You can see a little bit of that blue-green, 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 or greenish, whatever there. He's really taken the green. I can show you how we can do that. He's really taken the green there and made it lighter, but then also he's used a cooler green. And it's made it cooler simply by adding a little bit of blue into it. So, like this. See there? So, that kind of variation can be put. Let's see. I haven't got it quite blue enough. But anyway, you get the point. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether I get it. I'm getting closer there, but not quite. But what matters is that you're in that same range, but you can vary that hue just a little bit. You can make, say, the greens a little bit cooler. The oranges and reds, you can make them a little bit cooler, a little bit warmer, but you want to keep the temperature range. But the main thing is to use the colors that you see here, but slightly neutralized. So those are three of the main techniques that you can use for selecting your colors. Now I have a little reminder here of think about this as negative space, and remember, it should be supportive, never compete. You do not want to use highly saturated colors in your negative space. I'm going to say something. I don't care who does it. It doesn't work. So you don't want that negative space to compete with the still life itself. So always desaturate the colors that go in the negative space of a still life. So here are three things I think I advise avoiding, and you avoid those three things, then you should be good. To avoid the disconnected values, I talked about that. You don't want those values to contrast with each other in the negative space, because contrast is going to compete with the contrast in the positive space. So you want them to merge one into the other. Avoid the strong saturation, as I said before. Avoid conflicting textures. It's better to have the negative area smoother, so that we can read and feel the emphasis of the textures in the positive area. So I think you'll find if you would just practice those three techniques, keeping these points in mind, you will feel really, really good about your colors, the colors you choose for your still life paintings. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com, where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.